Hi there, I'm David Harvey, and I'm here with John Andrews, and this is the Two Texts podcast. In this podcast, we're two friends in two different countries, here every 2 weeks, talking about two different texts from the Bible. This is our second season. It's about the miracles of Jesus. And this is episode 19, and it's called Lazarus, Part 1. John, we have reached the final 2 episodes of the Miracles season, and we are amped up on miracles. and you said just before we hit record that if we can get through this current miracle in 2 episodes, that will be a miracle.
Yeah, not quite on the level of the resurrection of Lazarus, but I think it's going to... I mean, this is a monster chapter, so I have been so looking forward to reflecting with you on this. It's just an incredible story at so many levels. So, magnificent chapter, and I'm very excited about sharing.
Yeah, so we're going to take it in turns to read our way through this one because it's we're going to read from John chapter 11, verse 1, right the way through to verse 44, right? So you track this whole account of this story of Lazarus, and it's quite the thing, because here we are at the 7th of Jesus' signs in John's gospel, and they've been heading towards a sort of pinch point, haven't they? And this is the big one. And from this, the whole gospel then changes tone, doesn't it? We kind of move away from public ministry, and we end up in a long series of conversations privately with the disciples. So there's a lot going to happen in the next couple of episodes, I think. Yeah,
it's a bit of a tipping point in the gospel, isn't it? It feels like a tipping point moment in this incredible story.
So, do you want to take us away, John, at chapter 11 of John's Gospel and verse 1?
I'd be delighted to. So let's go. And now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago, the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." And Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he had meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Gotta love Thomas. You gotta love Thomas. You gotta love that. Beautiful.
So then picking it up at verse 17, it says, "On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is come into the world. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then some of the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?
Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odour, for he has been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Wow.
Whoa. I want to say so much about those 44 verses, and at the same time, there's a part of me thinks I want to go, and that's all we've got time for.
Absolutely.
Go and think about that for a few days. Like, what a story. What a story.
You're absolutely right. That has been, even reflecting on it and prepping for this recording, I've had exactly the same feeling of one of real excitement to delve in, because I think there's so many beautiful, beautiful things here. But I really felt a sense of awe. I remember many years ago visiting the Vatican in Rome and going to St. Peter's Basilica, an amazing building, and standing in the middle of the basilica and thinking, wow. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily personally be comfortable with everything in that building. I'm not really into buildings in that way in terms of expressing our worship to God, but actually you stand and you just go, wow. And I just wanted to stand in that building for a while and appreciate it. It was that magnificent and that awe-inspiring. And I think for me, John chapter 11 is that also. Part of me as a teacher wants to dive in and just teach and learn, and another part just goes, wow, this is so magnificent at so many levels. It's just beautiful stuff. So yeah, gorgeous. I know exactly how you feel there.
And it's almost like a disclaimer at the start of an episode like this. We will not cover everything that we want to talk about in this chapter.
True.
Because there's so many layers, and there's even a level of which, if you've been listening to our conversations about John's gospel towards the end of this miracles season, hopefully even by now there's resonances happening for you. There's things that we've pointed out in earlier stories that I'm hoping now you go, oh wait, there's that language again. Like, language around God's glory, how Jesus is revealing something of God's glory. The language of light, the language of walking in night, not in the light. The I am statement that just kind of snuck its way into that miracle story there. And then Jesus' relationships, this kind of really complex and deep relationship he clearly has with this family here. The onlookers are even able to assert that there is a relationship here that we've not seen with anybody else in Jesus. Right. This is, see how he loved him. This is the only family that we see this sort of relationship in that sort of way publicly at this point in the gospel. So there's a lot of layers to this chapter.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a great starting point. Is Jesus' relationship to this family. We've had a hint into that in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 10, where Mary sits at the feet of Jesus in the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and you get a sense that this is him sitting with friends. He's there, but it's not as explicit as it is here in John chapter 11. And in fact, our listeners may have picked up, if you were listening to the rhythm of the reading, 3 gorgeous references to this loveness that's going on. So verse 3, Lord, the one you love is sick. Verse 5, Jesus loved Martha and her sister Lazarus. So that's a comment from John himself inserting that. And in verse 36, the crowd see how he loved them. So you're getting 3 references from 3 sort of different sources, all touching in on the one idea that Jesus really loves this family. And I think that is something very precious. I think it gives us an insight into the relationships that Jesus has. I think we see him at a missional level reaching out to people, at a ministry level touching people, but clearly with this family there is a deep friendship level. There's a love level which comes across 3 times, and I just love this repeat idea. And David, there was something within this that I wanted to reflect with you on and maybe get your view to help maybe myself as well as the listeners. I noticed in looking at the original text of each of those references that there are 2 gorgeous Greek words used interchangeably. So in verse 3 and in verse 36, when it refers to Jesus loving them, it's phileo. And then in verse 5, when it says Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, it's agapeo. So you're getting the interchange of these 2 beautiful words and clearly used interchangeably, not only here, but in other parts of John's Gospel. He seems to flip between these 2 words quite comfortably. And that I couldn't help then but think about John 21 when Jesus is with Peter. Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, I do. And there's this tension between the idea that every time Jesus asks the question, at least the first 2 times, he uses agapeo. And then when Peter responds, each time he uses phileo. And then the third time, Jesus, and there's often been a lot made of that, and I'm wondering, do we sometimes make too much of that, and are these words just used much more comfortably interchangeably by John to essentially say a similar thing, or do you think there is some leverage in highlighting the difference?
Yeah, I've heard many sermons in my time where whole ideas were built on the different words in John 21. I come from a school of thought that thinks that by the time of John's gospel being written, and even by the time that Jesus is talking this, they're probably somebody might want to write in and disagree with this, and actually we're actually open to that sort of conversation. I think that probably by the time of John's gospel, the jump between agape and phileo is probably dissimilar to you and I's distinction that we would draw between sofa and couch. So maybe in times gone by they had very distinct differences, but by the time we get to the writing this gospel, I think that there's probably not much between them. I mean, C.S. Lewis brought this idea into, I think, a lot of kind of popular theology when he wrote the book about the 4 loves. And if you look classical Greek, classical Greek's very, very early. So it's earlier than the time of the New Testament being written. And it's very precise because it's the Queen's English version. It's really precise. Whereas, so like phileo and agape seem to have subtly different concepts in that sort of in that place. The New Testament is written in Koine Greek, quite literally common Greek. It's everyday Greek. And what you sort of see is that there can be times where words are used very specifically. You and I have talked about this throughout this podcast, so nobody's going to be surprised by that. What you have to do is sort of say, are there any clues or markers in the text that something's going on differently here? And I personally can't really see it. In fact, actually, this is one of the texts where you see John seems to just bounce these words around slightly differently. But obviously, it's God so loved the world. That's agape love that we get back in John chapter 3:16. But the fact that, like, here's a good example. It's being used interchangeably. There, hey, Jesus, you love Lazarus and he's sick. That's the message from Martha. John's comment is, yep, he actually loves all of them. Now, whether there's a level of nuance that Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So he's not just sad about what's happening with Martha. With Lazarus, he's sad about, because there's love sort of wider than that. Here's the thing as well, I think it's important to say, is that when you get to John chapter 21, so we don't need to jump in to read that just now. You can read that. You've got any time in your own space, someone can. But you've got this interchange between Peter and Jesus, where Jesus is picking up with Peter after his so Peter has now. I mean, you got to feel bad for Peter. He denies Jesus. That's a pretty rough situation. Like Jesus is coming to his death. One of the last things that Jesus sees of Peter is Peter denying him. Peter, like, is there anything worse than denying your friend before he gets killed? And I mean this with my tongue in cheek here, but also reverence, John. Well, perhaps the only thing worse is that friend coming back from the dead and meeting you at the beach 3 days later. And now you have to have that awkward conversation. But here's the thing that gets lost, and maybe this is an important point for anybody that's listening to our podcast that does a bit of preaching, is that sometimes a slightly complex and perhaps clever language point, like the first 2 times that Jesus says to Peter, "Do you love me?" the response he gets is phileo. And then finally you get this question of agape. It's a kind of, people make a lot of that point. Here's what's interesting to me. Whenever I've heard that made in a sermon, the sermon gets distracted by this kind of slightly, what actually I would argue is a tenuous Greek point. Yeah. But what gets missed is, to me, what's beautiful in the story is 3 times Peter was asked, "Do you know Jesus?" And Peter says no. And 3 times Jesus gives Peter the chance to say to him, "I love you." Right? And the fact that the 3rd time it says that Peter was hurt because Jesus asked the 3rd time, I think it's because now Peter realizes what Jesus is doing. That Jesus is unfolding, that he's given him 3 chances just to put everything back to normal again. And that almost always gets missed as the main point of this passage when we get caught up in an argument about what does phileo mean and what does agape mean. And I don't mean that to dismiss. I think people know our podcast well enough to know that's not to dismiss the value of looking at the original language. Of course. But sometimes getting caught up on that little detail can actually push you away from what actually John's trying to tell you, which is there in the English still, which I think is really exciting. I mean, does that make sense, John?
It does. It's a very good reflection, and I thought it was just an interesting, maybe for some of our listeners who are digging under the surface of, say, their English Bible into that, they may have spotted that, and I think for me, John 11 is a beautiful interplay of the word. And it's a seamless meaning throughout, which I'm very comfortable with within that. So it was great to have your reflections on that. So beautiful. But isn't that beautiful? And you don't get any other family, even any other individual. There's no other individual in the Gospels who gets this level of loveness officially on the record from Jesus. I mean, this is a loved up family. And we've got three dynamic references in the context of one of the greatest miracles in the Gospels. We've got three dynamic references that contextualize this miracle into an incredible relational love context. And Jesus clearly loves this family deeply. So I think that's worth bearing in mind, because we'll hit levels of emotion here in this story.
Yes.
And I think the emotion is not just because of the death of Lazarus at a technical level. I think this is about Jesus feeling something for this family, which in a gospel that highlights more than any that he is the Son of God, it's beautiful that his beautiful humanity is emphasized here, both in the context of this relationship and his emotion towards them. So I thought it was a reflection worth making on that. So yeah, thank you for that, David. Bless you.
There's also like an interesting. Let me make a comment here that we can edit out later if you decide this is way too heretical or threatening for our podcast. But there's even some scholars out there, John, that pick up on this theme of love and point something out that might feel a little uncomfortable. But you have this character in John's gospel called the beloved disciple. And tradition has held that that's John, right? We know that the beloved disciple is the writer of the gospel. That becomes clear by the last couple of chapters, doesn't it? Yeah. But at no point in the gospel is the beloved disciple's identity revealed.
True.
And so a lot of people say, yes, but the disciple John isn't mentioned in John's gospel. But then actually a deeper look, and you discover there's so many of the disciples, not none, sorry, but there's so many of the disciples are not mentioned in John's gospel. So there's a couple of scholars out there have picked up on this, and I just think it's curious. So again, please don't bet your house on this. Don't go telling someone mid-sermon that they're wrong in this. But here we have a disciple of Jesus, somebody that definitely is following Jesus. They're tracking with Jesus. Martha has announced it. You're the Messiah, the Son of God. I'm comfortable. Yeah. So I think it's fair to say Mary, Martha, Lazarus, they're disciples of Jesus.
Yep.
The text tells us very clearly they are loved by Jesus. Yeah. The one you love is sick. Right?
Yes.
So that's quite interesting. There's this guy out there. He's known as the beloved disciple, and Jesus gets a message. Hey, the one you love, he's sick, right? The beloved disciple doesn't appear in this story, by the way, in that reference. Everybody else then says, oh, by the way, Jesus, he really loved him, right? But what's really interesting then is at the end of John's gospel, there's this interaction and conversation with the beloved disciple and Jesus and Peter, right? And John just makes reference to this fact that there's this rumor out there that the beloved disciple will never die, right? And the beloved disciple writing the gospel kind of puts to death that rumor. Says, but that's not really what's going on here. But some scholars have said, wait a minute, this is interesting. You've got a beloved disciple who's unnamed. You've got a guy called Lazarus who everybody says Jesus loved. This guy called Lazarus died and Jesus rose again. And for some reason, there's a rumor that this beloved disciple will never die. There is a way to do those math that you end up with Lazarus being the beloved disciple and therefore potentially the author of John's gospel. Now,
wow.
We're just out in the ether of theories there for a second. But I don't know if that's too far off base. But I mean, how do you respond to something like that?
Well, it's an incredible sort of idea. I think there are some lovely nuances in the text that open that sort of conversation up. It's fascinating. I think, like many of our listeners, that will have been a brand new potential idea. And to be honest, I'm not really sure on that. I think where I would absolutely be comfortable in settling on is that there clearly is a level of love between Jesus and this family, which is incredible. And of course, Lazarus does become, as we see at the end of the story, and even into chapter 12, Lazarus becomes a real focal point for not only those who are putting their faith in Jesus, but even in a group of people who are trying to extinguish this ministry of Jesus. And they now see Lazarus as a threat because he's the one who's been raised from the dead. So there is a powerful subtext to that, which I think we sort of don't always appreciate in terms of Lazarus's influence from this moment on, which is an incredible one and may well factor in the way that gospel is constructed. But yeah, fascinating. I mean, just fascinating.
Well, I mean, by John chapter 12, verse 10, there's a plot to kill Lazarus as well as a plot to kill Jesus. I mean, listen, I make a comment like that because my hope is that someone's response to the Lazarus thing is just to go and read John's gospel a little bit more deeply. When I teach John's gospel, I talk about it as John's gospel. Like I'm not out there. I remember talking with a pastor once, and I was doing some teaching on this story, and I mentioned this to him, and he was like, "Oh, yeah, no, you can't say that on Sunday." He said, and which I completely get. I'm not trying to disturb anything, but I feel like if you're tracking with us in this podcast, you're sort of okay with us occasionally just going, "Hey, you know what? Some scholars have asked this question. Go have a look at it and see what you think yourself." Actually, in the grand scheme of things, it's a kind of fun little thing to explore. And if the net result is you just know John's gospel a little bit more by the end of it, then I feel like that's to be encouraged. Absolutely. And it doesn't change your faith in Jesus either.
No.
Which is
and
important.
It doesn't change the story. It doesn't change anything that we're talking about. It's one of those little, that's an interesting reflection. That's an interesting thought. I'm doing a little bit of work at the moment on my new book on John Mark, and there's a gorgeous little reflection in Mark's gospel of the young man who flees the garden so quickly that they grab his clothes and he flees naked. And there is a theory out there that the young man in the garden was John Mark himself. And of course, the timelines potentially track. Now, you couldn't build your house on that, but in the context of John Mark's story, his desertion, eventual desertion, his fall, his rise, it's a fascinating little, that's worth just tucking in the drawer. As we say, we wouldn't build our house on it, but it's a fascinating little reflection. And those gorgeous little highlights are all over the gospel. Yes. And you know, don't distract us, hopefully, but certainly create a little bit of interest.
But what it does, not dissimilar to your comment just there about Mark's gospel, what it does, it just leaves it out there. Like I said, don't build your house on it. Don't build anybody else's house on this either. No. But what it does mean is if there was any validity to it as a theory, what we're reading now is biography, is autobiography. Yeah. This is Lazarus now working that out. And how might that change how we read the story?
Yeah, fascinating. One of the things that struck me having just done John chapter 9 together, I heard a number of echoes in John 11 that we had picked up in John 9. And you'd made reference to this in the introduction, that if you're tracking the sort of Lucan stories we've done and the Johannine stories we've done, you start to pick up these little repeat thoughts and ideas. And I loved this lovely reference of verse 4. This sickness, he says, will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. And I couldn't help but hear the echo of John 9:3, where Jesus says, actually, when the disciples say, who sinned, this man or his parents? He said, well, actually, none of them. This is so that God's work, God's glory will be manifest.
Be displayed.
Absolutely. And then we go on in our John 11, where Jesus talks about, in verses 9 and 10, are there not 12 hours of daylight? You walk in the daylight, you don't stumble. If you walk at night, you do stumble. And a direct, again, echo of John 9:4, as long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. And of course, the 9 and 11 are two phenomenal signs. So this is, if you read John 11 as the seventh sign, and we've reflected on, is the resurrection of Jesus the seventh sign, which does have a gorgeous poetic theological symmetry to me. But if 11 is the final sign, then of course 9 is the penultimate sign. This is the build up to the sort of final one. And those gorgeous sort of links of both sicknesses are not actually about the person so much, but about what God's going to do through it, and also then the light and the darkness reflection. I don't know if you picked up, but I couldn't. I mean, that was an unmissable echo to me as I read the text.
Well, if you remember when we were talking about John 9, I pushed forward a little bit into that illusion of Jesus as the light, and the Judas betrayal narrative where Judas goes out into darkness, and then the next time we see Judas, he has a torch, and this even almost speaks to that even some more. Jesus is like, well, there's daylight, and if you walk in daylight, you don't stumble because you see. But when a person walks at night, they stumble because they have no light. And this is just, we're approaching this betrayal sort of narrative that's coming on here. And there's even a sense of verse 9, the person, John, I think, is always talking at double levels. Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. By the, by the light of this world, they see. The kind of Greek sentence format. You can't help but wonder, well, who is the light of this world, or what is the light of this world? Well, in John's gospel, it's Jesus. So is he literally talking about, hey, when you're walking down the road in daytime, you can see because there's light in the world? Or is he actually now moved into the metaphorical and is saying, hey, when you're on the journey of life, how are you seeing? It's beautifully, and I was with you, John, as well, because the line, I'm just scrolling to it because I have terrible memory for verse references. That says verse 37. Notice the allusion there back to chapter 9 as well. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And to me, I think that's a direct reference to the chapter 9 story. Because remember, we talked about how the blind man never gets named. He's just known as the blind man. And here he is 2 chapters later. He can see, and he's still being referred to as the blind man. The poor guy. Now, interestingly in that, of course, we see this messianic miracle kind of flow happening again, wherein we've talked about this elsewhere in this series, but think about the logic of that. Could not the person who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Well, which is the hardest of those miracles, making the blind person see or the dead person be raised? And this, I think, is where John's showing us insight into kind of Jewish messianic expectation, that this expectation of who is this liberator, this Messiah, this anointed one of God. Well, in the Old Testament, regular prophets raise the dead. Elijah and Elisha are in there doing that, but nobody helps the blind to see. So there's this sense that healing the blind is a messianic miracle. Raising the dead is kind of, a regular prophet can do that. I say a regular prophet with inverted commas, but a regular prophet can raise the dead, whereas only a Messiah can heal the blind. So for the people standing there, there's almost a level of, well, if he is the Messiah, this shouldn't be as hard for him as what we've seen him do already. So the chapter 9 miracle and the chapter 11 miracle, they're definitely adjacent pieces on the jigsaw puzzle. They're definitely hooked into each other.
Connecting together. Yeah, you do. And again, doesn't that show the beauty of reading a text like John? And we've reflected on this in other parts of the Gospels, reading a text in its flow. You get a sense of it starting to fit together for you and connect. Yes. And of course, you realize then what John is doing as well, and how these little bits of language bridge across these 2 magnificent stories, which are absolutely outstanding. So I thought it was a nice little allusion to make reference to.
Well, and of course, and you made the connection, and let just tie a bow on that just briefly. No, this is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. So that gives us a little tie back to the start of John chapter 9, but actually also ties us right the way back to that Johannine prologue in chapter 1, that he has come and revealed his glory to us. So again, why we spent that time talking about chapter 1 back at the start of this part of the season is you start to see he's tying, there's a little thread running its way through the whole narrative here. Now, transitioning on then a little bit to let's just talk about the strange bit of this story. If it's possible to have a strange bit of a story that's about the resurrection of someone who is dead, if there can be even something stranger. Now Jesus, verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Now the Greek then throws in this little conjunction, which is translated so in the NIV. Think about that, like accordingly.
Yeah.
Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 days more. like that's the logic of that statement is really interesting, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And I think there are sometimes awkward moments in a text that you just cannot ignore. And there is that sort of awkwardness there, that why would he do that? But I think we're sort of helped by his explanation later on. But it is a striking way in which that's connected together. He loved them, so he stayed.
Yeah, so he did nothing about it.
Yeah. So, and of course, even when we step away from that and think about our own understanding of the Lord and what the Lord should do, how the Lord should behave, what the Lord should do on our behalf, and how often we are prone as humans to judge his love for us according to what he does for us, or when he does it, or how he does it. This is a wonderfully paradoxical moment, and also slightly troublesome. We know big picture that Jesus is delaying because he has the resurrection of Lazarus in mind, because he clearly states that Lazarus is dead, he says. So that's go. So there's no confusion in Jesus' mind here as to what is happening. But of course that delay is troublesome, because it looks like Jesus doesn't care, and I think that's why John works so hard to tell us in the text, no, he really does care, because 3 times we get an emphasis that he loved this family. So it's not the lack of love, and the fact that he even joins this statement that he loves the family to staying 2 days means the delay is not lack of love, the delay is not lack of care. There's something deeper going on. Now, for our human brains, I think that's a difficult one. That it feels a little bit like, forgive me for this, listeners, it feels a little bit like the Lord's playing games with our lives. And of course, he's not. He's not. He has I was reading it this morning in my daily devotions, Isaiah 55. His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. There is a sense, of course, in which we are grappling with an infinite wisdom that is beyond ours, that can see things we can't see and understands things we can't understand. The cold reading of this text looks like it's uncaring, but John has worked very hard to show us, no, this Jesus loves his family, but he's delaying for a reason. And although we may not like that delay, we may not even understand that delay, there is a greater purpose for that delay, which ultimately, of course, comes to light.
And this section of the text, from that verse 6 right through then to verse 16, it is just almost about a descent into confusion. So you as the reader are taken on this journey of what actually is going on here. There's a little. You reminded me when you were talking just there. There's a book out there it's a novel by Richard Beard called Lazarus is Dead, and I don't know if everybody will be comfortable with this sort of type of work, but he essentially writes a novel in the gaps of this story. Right? Sure. Because it's fun. Like, if you can read this book and remember the whole time while you're reading it, all of this is made up, because the story leaves huge gaps for us, doesn't it? We don't know what happens in these 4 days. But what this guy does in writing this book, which is really interesting, is he picks up on this verse 18. Bethany is less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Right?
Indeed.
It's a half an hour walk, and it takes Jesus 4 days to get there. And so what he does is he writes this novel from the perspective of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, who are like, why is Jesus not coming? And Lazarus is getting progressively more ill, and then eventually he dies, and then eventually Jesus turns up. And it's I just really enjoyed it, John, in that sense, because the whole time you've disengaged from, this is not what actually happened. But I feel like it's sometimes interesting to drop into that space with the biblical characters and go, what would that be like? Jesus is like one of your best friends, if we can exaggerate, well, maybe not exaggerate, but there's clearly this very close love relationship between them all. And it's like, where has he got to? What's he doing?
Absolutely.
Why is he not?
Where is he?
Why is he not doing that? So, but this. Let's talk about this. I'm not here to try and sell someone else's book, but we talk about this descending sort of confusion. So, why are we not going back to Judea? Well, we are now. Then you get this sense of, well, there's people there that are pretty angry at you. Jesus' response is about walking in the light, not in the darkness. And then he tells them, Lazarus has fallen asleep. I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples reply, oh, well, if he's sleeping, he's going to get better. So that's pretty good. There's an old Jewish piece of wisdom in the Mishnah that says, if ever anyone's sick, you should only go and visit in the middle of the day. You should leave them alone in the morning and alone at night. It says, because if you go to visit a sick person in the morning, because they've just slept, they'll appear better and you'll forget to pray for them. And if you go and visit a sick person at night, they'll be really rough and you won't pray for them because you'll think there's no point. So you should only go and visit them in the middle of the day because then you'll remember to pray for them. So this is, in a sense, well, if you're sleeping, that's probably a good thing. And then you get, I love verse 14. So Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. It's like, come on, boys, you're not tracking with what I'm on about here. And, like, get with the program quickly. And so then just to add that, so just in case you have thought, well, maybe the disciples get what's going on here, Thomas throws in this line, well, let us go so that we can die too. Like, there's this whole sense of everybody speaking over the top of each other and nobody's paying any attention at all to what's happening, are they?
Yeah, and again, doesn't it show you how human this moment is? I think you've got, one of the magnificent things about chapter 11 is that the humanity of everyone is sewn into this story. So it will climax in a moment where a dead man comes to life and walks out of a grave, which is just stunning. But on the journey, you've got emotion, you've got confusion, you've got disappointment, you've got uncertainty, you've got words being missed in translation. It's all going on in the build up to this, but yet in the chaos, Jesus will bring something of order. He will bring light into the darkness of their confusion. He'll bring clarity into the uncertainty, and he'll bring life into the death. And you do get the sense of chaos in the early part of this story, and then the sense that Jesus brings order. He's the only calm mind in the room. He's the one that's not panicking, not running around. He seems to know what's happening, and so he's able to lead this. And of course, I know sometimes we criticize Thomas because it sounds a little bit pessimistic, but I think Thomas is reflecting the fact, and the Johannine text seems to reflect this, that there is a growing antagonism between Jesus and elements of the religious community. You know, back in John chapter 8, they did try to stone him, and that's the disciples reference that, and that's a scary thing. When you read that quickly, that doesn't sound like a problem, but that's a scary thing. Jesus is, especially in a Johannine text, is building a head of steam. The religious community are growingly worried about him, and even at the end of this story, this is a tipping point moment for them, where a plot is then put in place to destroy Jesus. So Thomas is not just being pessimistic or being skeptical, like some people have said. I think Thomas is just being really honest. He's saying, hey, there's a great chance that if we show our face in public again, we're sort of gonna get our heads knocked off. And so if that's the case, well, we might as well brace ourselves for what's coming. So I think we need to be fair to Thomas, because he's reflecting the confusion, the anxiety, and the uncertainty that they're all experiencing.
So push on then a little bit, John. There's then another level of confusion in a different way. So you like you say, you know what we've said about Thomas. Then he actually arrives and has this conversation with Martha and then with Mary, and Martha has this. I tell you what, here's one of the things I love about the conversation with Martha. I think Martha gets a bit of bad press sometimes by preachers because of the Mary and Martha story elsewhere.
Yeah.
So, it's almost become, at least within Christendom, there's language around it. Oh, I'm a bit of a Martha personality. Yeah, what that means is I prefer to be practical. I prefer to deal with just the things that are. Because there's this story, isn't there, where Mary and Martha are with Jesus. Martha's worrying about all of the kind of practicalities, and Mary is sitting listening. Yep. So Christendom's told the story of Martha, the practical, non-spiritual, non-devotional person, and Mary, the highly learned disciple of Jesus. But Martha puts together a theological conversation with Jesus here that suggests she was paying some attention while worrying about the practicalities, right?
Absolutely. Boom. I mean, she's on it. And in fact, if our listeners may have heard it, I think when you're hearing the text read as well as reading it, I think there's something very powerful. I mean, her confession is gold-plated messianic confession. This rivals Peter's confession. It's virtually word for word. There's just a couple of little differences in terms of how that confession's put together. But Mary is absolutely on the money. You are the Christ. I believe that. And it's an incredible statement within, I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was coming. Now, remember, John's writing his gospel so that we will believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Martha hasn't seen Lazarus rise from the dead yet, and she's already there. I mean, she's already in the zone as far as this confession is concerned, and it's absolutely incredible. I know there's confusion for her about when Jesus says your brother will rise again, and I think she naturally goes, yeah, I totally get that in the last days he'll rise. I totally understand that. And he goes, no, I'm the resurrection. So you're thinking of a resurrection that's coming. I am that resurrection. I'm going to do it right now. It's not that I can just raise people. I am the resurrection and the life. And then we push on into her sort of confession. I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was coming to the world. I mean, this is gold-plated. And I think so many people miss this in this story. They miss the fact that because we're rushing to the big Lazarus come forth moment, and why not? I mean, wow.
Yes.
We miss this absolutely amazing confession from this woman of God. Mm-hmm. I believe you are the Christ. You're the Son of God. Wow. Yeah, and it just seems to happen, and then people move on. It's whether it's a private conversation between Martha and Jesus, it's almost missed, except by the writer himself who records it for us. But it's an amazing moment and a huge echo of Peter's confession.
And I always am going to try and raise this flag as often as we get a chance to. We're two guys talking about the Bible, so just note that this is the messianic confession of John's gospel. So when you're talking, John, about how this is kind of parallel to Peter's confession, well, Peter's confession happens over in the other Gospels. So in John's Gospel, the confession that you are the Christ, the Son of God, is from the mouth of a woman, right? And I just think that has some significance to it. Highly patriarchal society that puts men first, that women are sidelined, and what you get is Martha being the one that makes the true confession. And even though we're going to, at some level, say she's slightly wrong about what she thinks in this conversation, she actually even believes in resurrection. She just doesn't realize it's about to happen to Lazarus now. But theologically, she is on point. In fact, she is as on point, and she is more on point, rather, than any other person you've seen in this gospel until. And I just don't think we should miss that John positions that fulcrum of the turn. Here's the confession, and it's not one of the men disciples. It's not Peter. It's Martha. It's not even Mary. It's Martha that makes the statement. I love that, John. I think that's
so do I. So do I. I think it's a beautiful redress of the balance. Luke shows Mary at the feet of Jesus in Luke 10. And it's interesting in John's account here of the resurrection, Mary falls at the feet of Jesus. So Luke has her sitting at the feet of Jesus. John has her falling at the feet of Jesus. And then the very later on, I think it's the next chapter, chapter 12, he has her anointing the head of Jesus. So it's just beautiful imagery going on here. But it is Martha, not Mary, who's saying this. And I love that, the sort of Martha was clearly listening. Martha was clearly engaging. There's clearly not just a sense that Jesus loves them. There's an absolute sense that Martha loves him. And she is connecting with him in the lead up to this amazing moment. So I love that. Absolutely love that.
And even just as we're talking about it, John, you can even push the contrast a little further, I think, without being disingenuous to the text. But you've got two conversations happening. The conversation between Jesus and the disciples and the conversation between Jesus and Martha. And I think Martha is slightly wrong in terms of timing. Okay? She believes that Lazarus will rise. She believes that Jesus is the Messiah and that he's the Son of God. And the tweak for her is the resurrection of Lazarus is coming soon. And in fact, the other tweak is that resurrection is coming even soon, the resurrection of Jesus. Whereas the disciples, the male disciples, are largely in a bit of a tiz. They're not clear. So you have this really interesting parallel between the ones that should be clear that don't seem to have any, they're getting it all wrong. Let's go and get stoned together with Jesus. And then you have Martha with this, you're the Messiah, you're the Son of God, I know that resurrection's coming. Right? It's a really interesting little contrast to not lose, particularly when Christian history has been so silencing of women so many occasions, that John's gospel gives Martha such a prime spotlight position to allow her to be the mechanism to let Jesus roll out this final I am statement, that I am the resurrection and the life.
And isn't it beautiful that Martha does a sort of a very Johannine thing then at that point? So after the confession, what does she do? She goes and gets Mary. So for some reason, Mary isn't aware that Jesus is there. I think our listeners may be aware that there are large groups of people here mourning. Mary and Martha are probably not together when it's heard that Jesus is on the edge of the village. Martha gets up and goes, and then she has this incredible encounter with Jesus. There's almost an echo for me of the woman of Samaria. There's something going off inside Martha where she goes, I need to get Mary. I need to go and bring her here right now. And then she goes and calls Mary and says the teacher's asking. What's really interesting, of course, is that explicitly there's nothing in the text to say that Jesus did ask for Mary. But Martha goes back and says, right, the teacher's here. He's asking for you. And then, of course, and I love the little nuance in verse 29 that Mary got up quickly and went there. So when she heard that Jesus was calling her, she went for it. So it seems to imply that Mary didn't know that Jesus was there. Martha goes. But then there's a beautiful Johannine thing there that this, you often get people meeting Jesus in John's gospel and then going and getting someone and bringing them to meet Jesus. The sort of come and see stuff, which is a lovely echo of that later on here. But this come and see stuff. And Martha goes and says, Mary, he's here. Come to Jesus now. Come and see him. Now, those words aren't explicitly used, but I think that's a gorgeous Johannine. Again, it's one of those little repeat ideas we're seeing right from the beginning of the gospel of come and see, come and see, come and see, come and see. Absolutely. Yes. I love that. And so Martha isn't just confessing that he's the Christ. She's now almost, forgive me, listeners, if I stretch this too far, but she's almost operating evangelistically. She's goes from Jesus to get someone to bring them to Jesus, and you get this gorgeous then almost echo of the first conversation when Martha speaks to Jesus as well.
And so let's pause that there, John, and we'll be back in a couple of days to really jump from where it's like one of those Netflix series where it's like, oh no, we're not got time to finish it just yet. But we're going to jump from the arrival of Mary then into the gathering, the crowd, and them arriving at the tomb where Lazarus is lying. So we'll be back in a couple of days. unless you're listening to this and it's not live, at which point you can just start listening to the next episode now. So that is it for today. The second part will release on Thursday. If you want to get in touch with either of us about something we said during this episode, then reach out to us on podcast@twotext.com or by liking and following the Two Text Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Don't forget that you can listen to all of our podcasts at www.twotext.com or wherever you get podcasts from. But that is it for part 1, and we're back on Thursday with part 2. So until then, goodbye.